Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, I make videos about real experiences, stuff that actually happened to people, stories that kept them up at night. Today's story comes from a woman I'll call Mara. She shared it with me and gave me permission to tell it. And honestly, after reading it, I couldn't stop thinking about it for days. So get comfortable, maybe turn the lights on if it's late, and let's get into it. Mara had always loved the outdoors. That's the kind of person she was. Not in a performative way, not just for Instagram photos by a lake. She genuinely loved it. She grew up in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, where the forest basically started right at the edge of the backyard. As a kid, she'd spend whole afternoons just wandering between the trees, learning how the light changed in there, how the air smelled different under the canopy than it did in the open field, how quiet it could get when you went deep enough in. So by the time she was in her late 20s, solo hiking and camping felt completely natural to her. She'd done it dozens of times. Short trips, long trips, overnight stays, week-long treks. She had good gear, she was physically fit, she knew how to read a map and a trail, and she had enough common sense to be careful without being scared. She was, by every reasonable measure, exactly the kind of person who should be doing this kind of thing. The trip she's telling us about happened in early summer, about 3 years ago now. She'd picked a trail up in the northern part of the state, not too far from the Canadian border. It was a place she'd always meant to visit, but never had. A stretch of old-growth forest that followed a river valley up into the foothills of a small mountain range. The trees up there were enormous. She'd seen pictures. Cedars so wide that 3 people standing with their arms out couldn't wrap around them. Firs so tall they seemed to disappear into the low clouds. Moss covering everything. The ground, the rocks, the fallen logs. Like the whole forest was slowly being swallowed by something soft and green. She told me she drove up on a Friday morning, parked her car at the trailhead, double-checked her pack, and set off. The plan was simple. Hike in about 8 miles the first day to a designated campsite near the river, spend 2 nights there, and hike out on Sunday afternoon. A clean, simple trip. Nothing experimental, nothing she hadn't done before in some variation. The first few hours were exactly what she'd been hoping for. The trail was well maintained. The weather was cool and overcast, which she actually preferred. No glare, no sweating through her shirt in the first mile. The forest around her was dense and old and beautiful. Massive root systems broke up through the ground on either side of the path. The river ran somewhere to her left, mostly hidden by the undergrowth, but she could hear it the whole time. That constant rushing sound that's somehow both quiet and loud at once, depending on how much you're paying attention to it. She saw a deer early on, just standing at the edge of a small clearing, watching her with no particular alarm. She stopped. It looked at her for a long moment, then slowly walked into the trees. She kept going. She passed a couple of hikers heading the other direction, a man and a woman, maybe in their 50s, clearly finishing up their own weekend. They exchanged the usual pleasantries. "Nice day. Good trail. Be careful near the river, the bank's a little slippery further up." The normal stuff people say on trails. By early afternoon, she'd reached the campsite. It was a flat clearing near the riverbank, ringed by a half-circle of enormous trees. There were the remains of an old fire ring in the center, stones blackened from years of use. She set up her tent, hung her food bag from a branch using her bear line, gathered some wood, and got a small fire going as the sky started to go gray. She made dinner, nothing fancy, just a dehydrated meal from her pack, hot tea from the river water she'd filtered, and sat for a long time just listening. That's one of the things about being deep in a forest at night that people don't talk about enough. It's not silent. It's never silent. There's always something going on. Birds settling in, wind moving through the upper branches, the river, insects, the occasional crack from somewhere in the trees that makes you look up even when you know it's probably just a branch falling. The forest has its own sound, its own breathing almost. And when you sit still long enough, you stop hearing it as noise and start hearing it as a kind of language you don't quite speak. She slept well that first night. No weird sounds, no strange feelings, just good, clean tiredness and the smell of pine and damp earth and smoke from the fire she'd let die down to coals before zipping up her tent. She woke up Saturday morning feeling good, rested. The kind of rested that only really happens when you've been away from screens and noise for a full day. She made coffee, sat outside in the cool morning air, watched the mist moving through the trees on the other side of the river. She had no particular plans for the day. Maybe a short walk upstream, maybe just reading, maybe just sitting. That was the whole point of the trip, really, to do nothing and let it feel like enough. It was later that day, somewhere in the mid-afternoon, that she first noticed something that didn't quite fit. She'd been sitting by the river for maybe an hour, her boots off, feet in the cold water, just staring at the current, when she had the feeling that someone was watching her. Not a dramatic, heart-stopping feeling, more like that low-level background hum of awareness you sometimes get. The kind that makes you look up without really knowing why. She looked up. The forest on the opposite bank was still and dark. Nothing moved. She waited. Still nothing. She told herself it was probably an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, or even a bear keeping a safe distance and watching her with quiet curiosity, the way animals sometimes do. She put her boots back on anyway. The rest of that afternoon she spent closer to camp. She told herself it wasn't because of the feeling she'd had by the river, that she'd just decided she wanted to read, which was true enough. But she was aware, on some level, that she'd chosen to move back toward the familiar ground of her tent and her fire ring and the things that were hers. The forest didn't feel threatening exactly. That's important to say. It felt the same as it had that morning, old and enormous and indifferent, the way forests always feel when you're honest about what they actually are. But something in the quality of the afternoon had shifted, the way light sometimes shifts before a storm, even when there are no clouds yet. You don't know what you're sensing, you just sense it. She made an early dinner. She got the fire going earlier than the night before. She told herself this was because the clouds were thickening and it was going to be a cold night, which was also true. But she sat closer to the fire than she needed to, and she kept looking up at the tree line. Around 7 in the evening, as the light was starting to go golden and low through the gaps in the canopy, she heard footsteps on the trail coming into the campsite. Not twigs snapping, actual footsteps, the measured crunch of boots on packed earth. She stood up without quite deciding to, and turned toward the sound. A woman came around the bend in the trail. She was maybe Mara's age, late 20s, with a small day pack on her back and a light jacket, the kind of outfit you'd wear for a short hike, not a multi-day trip. She stopped when she saw Mara and smiled, that immediate relieved smile you sometimes see on someone who's been alone longer than they expected. "Oh, thank God," the woman said. "I was starting to think I was the only person left on Earth out here." Mara laughed, and some of the tension she hadn't fully acknowledged went out of her shoulders. She introduced herself. The woman said her name was Claire. She explained that she'd parked at a different trailhead about 4 miles back and had been doing a day loop, but she'd taken a wrong turn somewhere and added a couple of hours to the route and was now running out of daylight. Mara didn't hesitate. She invited her to stay. There was room at the campsite. She had extra food, and hiking out on an unfamiliar trail in the dark with a simple day pack was a bad idea, regardless of how confident you felt. Claire accepted gratefully, dropped her pack, and sat down across the fire. They talked easily. That's what Mara remembers most about the first hour or so. How easy it was. Claire was funny and warm, and had a quick way of making observations about things that made Mara laugh. She worked in landscape architecture, she said. She'd grown up in the Midwest, but moved west for school and never went back. She hiked whenever she could, usually with friends, but she'd decided to do this loop alone on a whim because her weekend plans had fallen through and she hadn't wanted to waste the weather. The fire crackled between them. The light left the sky slowly, the way it does in summer. The river kept running just beyond the edge of the trees. Mara told me it felt genuinely nice, the specific pleasure of unexpected company in a place you'd expected to be alone. It was somewhere around 9 o'clock, the sky fully dark now, when Mara got up to get more wood from the small pile she'd collected that afternoon. She stepped away from the fire, and in the sudden relative darkness at the edge of the camp, she stopped. She stood very still. The feeling was back. That awareness, that sense of being observed, but stronger now, much stronger. She stood with the wood in her arms and looked out at the trees and the darkness between them, and felt, with a certainty she couldn't explain and didn't try to, that something was out there, something that had been there for a while. She went back to the fire. She didn't say anything to Claire about it. She didn't want to sound paranoid. She didn't want to describe a feeling she couldn't justify with anything concrete. They kept talking. But from that point on, Mara was doing two things at once, having a conversation and listening, underneath it, to the forest. About 20 minutes later, Claire stood up to go to the edge of the trees to use the bathroom. She took her small headlamp from her pack, switched it on, and walked about 30 feet into the darkness, off to the left side of the camp. Mara watched the little circle of light moving through the trees, bobbing slightly as Claire walked. It stopped. It was still for a moment. Then Mara heard Claire's voice, not panicked, but very flat and controlled, the way voices get when the body is afraid and the brain is trying to stay calm. "Mara," she said, "come here. Don't run. Just come here now." Mara got up. She grabbed her own headlamp from her tent and crossed the dark grass to where Claire was standing. Claire's headlamp was pointed at the ground just ahead of her. On the soft earth of the forest floor, clearly visible in the beam of the light, were boot prints. Large, heavy ones. Going in, not coming out. They stood side by side, looking at them for a long moment without speaking. The prints went into the darkness between the trees and simply stopped being visible. Whoever had made them had come in from the campside, from behind where they'd been sitting, and gone out into the deeper forest. And based on the freshness of the impression in the wet earth, based on how crisp the edges still were, they hadn't been made long ago at all. They didn't sleep much that night. They didn't talk about that either, about the fact that neither of them was sleeping, but Mara could hear Claire shifting in her sleeping bag every few minutes, and she knew Claire could probably hear her doing the same. They'd moved their sleeping arrangements to be inside Mara's tent together, which Claire had suggested with a kind of casual practicality that made it easier for both of them to accept, without having to say out loud that they were scared. Mara lay on her back in the dark and listened. The forest did what it always did, breathed, rustled, ran, clicked and ticked and murmured. But every sound now had a new quality, a possibility attached to it. She kept trying to separate the sounds into categories: wind, animal, water. Every time she thought she heard something that didn't fit neatly into one of those, her whole body went still. At some point, probably 2 in the morning, she did fall asleep. She woke up to gray early light pressing through the tent fabric, and birds somewhere overhead doing the complicated, layered thing birds do at dawn in old forest. Claire was already awake, sitting up, looking at her phone, even though there was no signal. "I think we should go," Claire said, not frantic, just decided. Mara agreed. She didn't try to talk herself out of it with logic, with the reminder that boot prints could have any number of explanations, that someone could have been passing through, that the forest was public land and other people had every right to be in it. All of that was true. None of it changed the feeling. They broke camp quickly, efficiently, without much conversation. Mara packed her tent and her gear. Claire shouldered her small day pack. They doused the remnants of the previous night's fire with water from the river, making sure the coals were completely dead. By 6:30, they were ready to go. The trail out followed the river south for the first few miles, before cutting east through a stretch of older, darker forest, and then opening up onto a long ridgeline walk. Mara had done this section in reverse on the way in, and knew it reasonably well. She took the lead. Claire stayed close behind. The morning was cold and quiet, and very beautiful, in the way that mornings are when you are outside and frightened. Everything slightly too sharp, slightly too vivid, the colors a little too saturated, the sounds coming from too many directions at once. The ferns along the riverbank were silver with dew. The mist was low and slow-moving through the trees. Twice, a bird burst out of the undergrowth right next to the trail, and both times Mara's heart slammed against her ribs before she could process what it was. They were maybe a mile and a half out from the campsite, in a section where the trail narrowed and the trees pressed in close on either side, when Claire said quietly, "Don't look back yet, but I think someone's behind us." Mara didn't look back. She kept walking. She matched her breathing to her steps, slow and deliberate, the way she'd read you're supposed to do when you need to stay calm. After 5 more seconds, she said, "Quote 6, quote 7, quote 8, quote 9. Claire said. Her voice was flat in a way that meant she didn't think so. They kept walking. The trail curved, and in curving, gave Mara a natural reason to glance back as she rounded the bend. She did. The trail behind them was empty. Gray path, green trees, white mist. Nothing moving. She turned forward again. "I don't see anyone," she said. "I know," Claire said. "That's what worries me." The thing is, and Mara was very specific about this when she told me, there was nowhere to go. On either side of the trail at that point, the undergrowth was dense and tangled, ferns and salal and low bramble packed in under the trees. You could push through it, but you couldn't walk quickly through it. You couldn't move through it without making a lot of noise. So whoever had been behind them, if someone had been behind them, had either stopped or stepped off the trail and into that undergrowth and gone completely silent. Both options were strange. The second one was considerably stranger. They picked up their pace. Not running. Mara made a conscious choice not to run, partly because the trail was uneven, and a turned ankle out here would be a serious problem, and partly because running felt like an acknowledgement she wasn't ready to make. But they moved fast, heads up, no talking. The trail started climbing. This was the section she remembered, a long, steady rise through a stretch of forest that was somehow even older and denser than what they'd come through, the canopy so high and thick above them that it felt like the inside of a cathedral. The light here was greenish and indirect. The air smelled strongly of earth and something resinous and sweet. Under other circumstances, Mara told me, it would have been one of the most beautiful places she'd ever been. About halfway up the climb, on a switchback, she heard it. A sound, somewhere off the trail to their left, in the dense undergrowth on the uphill side. A slow, careful, rhythmic sound. Footsteps, keeping pace with them. She and Claire looked at each other. They didn't stop walking. "Keep going," Mara said quietly. "Steady pace. Don't look." The sound continued for another 20 or 30 meters, parallel to the trail, just out of sight. Then it stopped. Then, nothing. The forest. The river, distant now. Their own breathing. They made it to the ridgeline. The trees opened up. The sky appeared. Real sky. Blue and wide and enormous after the enclosed green dark of the forest below. They both stopped for a moment and just stood in the open air and breathed. From up here you could see for miles. The valley they'd come out of, the silver thread of the river, the mountains further north. Nothing came out of the trees behind them. They stood there for 2 minutes, 3, watching the tree line. Nothing. They kept going. The ridgeline walk was exposed and long, maybe 2 miles of open trail, with a valley on one side and a steep drop on the other. The kind of terrain where you can see everything around you for a long distance, and there's nowhere to hide, for you or for anyone else. Mara told me that section felt like breathing again after being underwater. She still didn't feel safe exactly, but she felt visible, and visibility felt like protection. They talked during that stretch. Claire asked questions about the trail, about the area, and Mara answered them. And they both understood that the talking was as much about maintaining some sense of normalcy as it was about actual curiosity. At one point, Claire laughed at something Mara said, genuinely laughed, and the sound of it in the open air was startling and good. About halfway across the ridge, Mara stopped. She held up a hand, and Claire stopped too. Down below, at the edge of the tree line where the trail emerged from the forest onto the ridge line, something had moved. It was too far to see clearly. A shape, roughly human-sized, at the margin of the trees. It didn't step out onto the open trail. It stayed at the edge, in the shadow where the forest began. And it was still, just standing there, looking up the ridge. They stood and looked back at it for a long moment. "We need to move," Claire said. They moved. They kept their pace controlled. Mara kept telling herself not to run, not to run. But they moved fast, and they didn't look back again. At the far end of the ridgeline, the trail dipped back down into forest, and they went in, and the trees closed over them, and Mara felt something she hadn't expected. Relief. Because at least in the trees, there were things between you and whatever that had been. The last 4 miles were through second-growth forest, younger trees and more undergrowth. The trail wider and more maintained here, with distance markers every half-mile. They saw another hiker, a man with 2 dogs, one of which immediately came bounding toward them. And the sight of him was so ordinary, so deeply and completely ordinary, that Mara felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. They didn't stop to talk to him. They said hello, said, "Nice dogs," kept walking. The parking lot appeared through the trees, and Mara had the same feeling she imagined people had coming out of surgery. That slightly unreal, slightly too bright sense of a world continuing that you weren't sure was going to continue. Her car was right where she'd left it. Claire's was in the far corner of the lot, muddy around the wheel wells from the unpaved access road. They stood between the 2 cars. Claire looked at her. She said, Mara said, and they both knew she was saying it to be kind. They exchanged numbers. Claire said she'd text when she got home. She did. The text just said, "Safe. You?" Mara texted back, "Safe." She sat in her car for a while before she started the engine. She just sat there with the doors locked and the windows up and looked at the trail entrance in the rearview mirror. The trees, the shadows between them. Nothing came out. She drove home. She spent that evening doing all the ordinary things, unpacking, showering, making food, sitting on her couch. And she kept cycling back to the boot prints in the soft earth, the crisp edges, the way they went into the darkness and didn't come out, the shape at the tree line, the footsteps that kept pace with them on the climb. She told herself, and she was honest with me about this, about the fact that she did this deliberately, consciously. She told herself a version of events that made sense. Someone else was camping in the area, had walked through, had perhaps been curious about the camp, had walked the same trail at the same time the next morning, happened to be going at a similar pace, had stopped at the ridge, maybe to check a map, maybe to rest. She told herself all of that. She also called a friend that night, and she talked for 2 hours. And at the end of it, her friend said, and Mara said, and then she said. Her friend was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mara said. She didn't go back to that trail. She still hikes, she told me. Still goes solo. Still loves it. Still needs it the way some people need a particular kind of quiet that you can only get in certain places. But she's changed some things. She leaves earlier when something feels off, without arguing with herself about whether the feeling is justified. She trusts the animal part of her brain a little more readily now. She also told me one more thing, almost as an aside, almost like she wasn't sure whether to include it. She said that when she got home and looked through her phone, she'd taken some photos on the trail the first day, the deer in the clearing, the river, some of the big trees. She found one photo she didn't remember taking. It was blurry, taken from ground level, pointed up at the canopy. A photo of the inside of her tent, basically. The green fabric roof, the mesh pocket where she kept her headlamp, the dim, filtered light of afternoon. She must have accidentally taken it. She deleted it, but she couldn't shake the feeling, which she said she knew was irrational, that the angle was wrong, that the photo was taken from a position lower, near the ground, that wasn't quite where she would have been. She deleted it and didn't look at it again. I want to pause here for a second and say, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, okay, was this actually dangerous? Or was it just a series of things that felt scary, but had completely ordinary explanations? And I want to be honest with you. I don't know. Mara doesn't know. That's actually part of what makes it stay with her. But here's what she told me next, and this is where it gets harder to explain away. About 3 weeks after the trip, Mara was at home on a Sunday afternoon when Claire texted her. Not a long message, just, "Hey, weird question. Have you looked anything up about that trail area?" Mara texted back, "No, why?" Claire's response took a few minutes. Then, "Can I call you?" They talked. Claire said she'd been doing some research, the kind of research you do when something is bothering you and you're not sure why, when you keep catching yourself thinking about it at odd moments. She'd gone looking for information about the area, the trail, the campsite. She'd found some things. She told Mara that there had been 2 separate incidents reported in that area in the 5 years before their trip. Not accidents, not hikers getting lost or hurt, but reports filed with the rangers about a man observed following and approaching solo hikers, specifically women, specifically on that trail and the 2 connected trails in the same forest system. The reports were sparse. One woman had written a trip report on a hiking forum describing being followed for several miles. Another had called the ranger station directly. In both cases, the man was described differently enough that it wasn't clear if it was the same person. One report said medium height, dark clothing, no visible gear. The other said tall, hiking clothes, a small pack. No one had been hurt. No one had been caught. No formal investigation had been opened because there wasn't enough to go on. Claire had also found one more thing. In one of the forum posts she'd gone through, someone had replied to the original trip report about being followed with a comment that they'd had a similar experience in the same area. They said they'd been camping solo, this person wasn't specific about gender, when someone had approached their camp asking about a cabin, saying they were looking for a specific shelter. Mara said she went cold when Claire told her that, because neither she nor Claire had mentioned the boot prints to anyone. Neither of them had posted anything online. Whatever had been happening in that forest wasn't random, wasn't an opportunistic thing. It was a pattern. The cabin story, the approach, the following, the waiting. She didn't tell me what she did with that information in terms of reporting it, because by then, there wasn't much to report. Nothing had happened to her, and the incidents she'd found were years old and already documented. But she thought about it. She thought about the woman who'd written the forum post about being followed. She thought about how close those trails ran to each other, how someone who knew that forest well who'd spent time in it, who understood its paths and its patterns, could move through it in ways that a visitor wouldn't anticipate. She thought about the boot prints going in and not coming out. She thought about the shape at the tree line. She thought about the footsteps on the climb, parallel to the trail, keeping pace. And she thought about the photo she'd deleted, the one she didn't remember taking, the one angled up at the roof of her tent from the ground. She told me she wishes she hadn't deleted it. Not because she wants to look at it, she's very sure she doesn't want to look at it, but because she wants to know. She wants to understand whether it was what she thinks it might have been, or whether it was something that had a reasonable explanation. She'll never know now, and she's made a kind of peace with that. The not knowing, she said, is actually easier than she expected it to be, because the knowing, either way, would require her to fully face what that week meant, and she's not sure she's ready for that. What she is ready for, what she does do, is pay attention. She trusts the feeling now, the one by the river, the one at the edge of the firelight, the animal part of the brain that doesn't explain itself but just knows. She trusts it, and she acts on it, and she doesn't wait for evidence that satisfies the rational part of her. She goes into the forest, and she loves it, and it's still the most beautiful thing she knows. But she goes differently now. And honestly, after everything she told me, I think that's the right call. Now, I want to go back to something, because when Mara first described Claire to me, something snagged in my mind, and I let it go, and then later it came back. She said Claire had a day pack, a small one, the kind you take on a 4 or 5 hour hike, not a full day loop of what she'd described as 8 miles or more of trail. She said Claire was wearing a light jacket, not a rain jacket, not anything with insulation, a light jacket, on an evening that both of them agreed was cold. I'm not saying this to cast doubt on Claire. I want to be clear about that. Everything Mara told me about Claire's behavior was consistent with someone who was genuinely lost and grateful to find another person. She was warm, she was funny, she was the one who noticed the boot prints. She was the one who spotted whoever was behind them on the trail the next morning. If she was involved in anything, and I'm not suggesting she was, her behavior makes no sense. But here's the thing about that forest, about being deep in a place that old, and that large, and that indifferent. It changes your perception of things. You stop being able to accurately judge time and distance. You start misremembering details. Mara told me she's gone back over that weekend many times in her memory, and details keep shifting slightly. Where things happened, the exact sequence of events, what was said. Not dramatically, just the way memories of intense experiences always degrade slightly around the edges. So when I say that something about Claire's description snagged, I'm not drawing a conclusion. I'm just noting it. The way Mara noted it too, when I mentioned it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I've thought about that." And I said, "And?" And she said, "And I think she was exactly who she said she was. I think she was a woman who made a wrong turn on a trail and ended up at my campsite and was scared, and then helped me get out." She paused. "I think that because I need to think that." I understood what she meant. The alternative, that Claire's appearance was something other than coincidence, that the wrong turn was something other than accidental, that the whole thing was more orchestrated than it appeared. That alternative is the kind of thought that once you start following it, doesn't have a comfortable end. And Mara had been living with this for 3 years already. She'd found the equilibrium that let her keep going into forests, keep hiking alone, keep loving the thing she'd always loved. The story she needed to tell herself was the one that let her do that. I respect that completely. I'm not going to be the person who takes that from her. What I will say is this: the forest doesn't know you. That's not a frightening thing on its own, it's just a true thing. It's vast, and it's old, and it runs on rules that have nothing to do with your comfort or your safety or your sense of how the world should work. You go into it as a visitor, and you come out, and it closes over the space where you were, and there's no sign you were ever there. Most of the time, that's beautiful. Most of the time, the indifference of the forest is actually the thing you're going looking for. The relief of being in a place that doesn't need anything from you. But occasionally, that same indifference is what allows other things to happen. Things that don't announce themselves. Things that move through the undergrowth in parallel, keeping pace. Things that wait. Mara knows this now. She knows it in her body, in a way that didn't get there through reasoning. It got there the way most important things get there. Through experience, through fear, through the specific weight of a dark night in a tent while you listen to a forest breathe and wait to understand what it's saying. She's fine. That's the thing I want to make sure I say clearly. She's fine. Nothing happened to her in any concrete, physical sense. She camped, she hiked out, she drove home, she texted her friend and said she was safe. But she told me, and this is the thing I keep coming back to, she told me that the moment that lives most clearly in her memory, the one that replays with the most detail and the most texture, isn't the boot prints, isn't the shape at the tree line, isn't even the footsteps in the undergrowth. It's the moment by the river on that first afternoon. Her feet in the cold water, the rushing sound, the mist on the opposite bank, and the feeling, quiet, certain, like a hand on her shoulder, that she was not alone. That moment, that's the one that stays. I want to tell you what Mara thinks happened, in her own words, as best I can reconstruct them, because I think it's important to give her the space to say it, rather than me interpreting it. She thinks there was someone in that forest who had been watching her campsite, possibly since before she arrived, certainly by the end of the first day. She thinks that person was experienced in the woods, comfortable moving through dense undergrowth, familiar with the trail system, practiced at remaining unseen. She thinks that person's intentions were not good. She can't say more than that. She doesn't know what the plan was. She doesn't know what would have happened if she had stayed a third night alone, if Claire hadn't appeared, if they hadn't made the decision to leave early. She doesn't know if the two incidents Claire found in her research were connected to whatever this was. She suspects they might have been. She thinks that leaving when they did, in the early morning, before they'd fully processed how frightened they were, was the decision that mattered. She thinks that the instinct to move, not the reasoning, not the logic, not the explanation, just the instinct, was the thing that kept them safe. If they had talked themselves into staying another day, if they had decided the boot prints had an innocent explanation and not worth upending their plans over, she doesn't know how that story ends. She told me she's grateful for Claire, for the matter-of-fact way she said, "We need to go," for not requiring Mara to be the one to say it first, because Mara might have waited for something more definitive, might have wanted one more clear sign before making the call. And in situations like that, one more sign is sometimes one too many. That's the thing about instinct. It doesn't come with a certificate of authenticity. It doesn't show you its credentials. It just lands in the body as a certainty, but has no evidence attached to it. And you either act on it, or you don't. And only later, sometimes only much later, sometimes never, do you find out whether it was real. The boot prints had crisp edges. That's evidence. The shape at the tree line is evidence, assuming she saw what she thinks she saw and didn't misinterpret a shadow in a moment of heightened anxiety. The footsteps in the undergrowth, those she's less certain about. Those might have been an animal. She genuinely doesn't know. But the feeling by the river on the first afternoon, the one that had no evidence at all, the one that came before anything else had happened, the one she ignored and explained away. That one she believes. In retrospect, that was the first thing, the real first thing. Everything else came after. She goes into the forest differently now. She told me she has a rule. If the feeling comes, she names it. She says it out loud, even if she's alone. She says, "I feel like I'm being watched," or "Something is wrong here." She says it out loud because naming it makes it real enough to act on. Otherwise, it stays in the background, just below the level where you have to deal with it, and you explain it away, and you stay, and you wait to see. She doesn't wait to see anymore. The trail is still there. The forest is still there. The enormous cedars and the river and the mist and the birds doing the complicated thing at dawn. All of it is still there, doing what it does, going on in the way it goes on, regardless of who walks through it. If you went there tomorrow, you would probably have a beautiful, peaceful, entirely unremarkable trip, and come home sunburned and tired, and already planning the next one. Probably. Mara goes back to the forest. Just not that forest. She's drawn a line there, around that particular place, and she keeps it. She doesn't feel like it's a defeat. She doesn't feel like she gave something up. She feels like she made a reasonable decision based on information she has that most people don't. The knowledge of what it felt like to be in those trees when something in those trees was watching her. Most information costs something to get. That particular piece of knowledge cost her quite a lot. She's decided to use it. Okay, so that's Mara's story. And I've been sitting with it for a while now, thinking about what it means and what I want to say about it. And I keep coming back to one thing. We're very good at explaining away the things we feel. We've been trained to do it, really. From the time we're small, we're taught that feelings aren't facts, that the rational explanation is the correct one. But the creeping sense you get in a dark place is just your nervous system being oversensitive. Just evolution's excess caution. Just your brain pattern matching on incomplete information. And most of the time, that's right. Most of the time, the noise is just the house settling. Most of the time, the shadow is just a shadow. Most of the time, you look up and there's nothing there. But the brain didn't evolve that response for no reason. The feeling of being watched exists because being watched by something that means you harm is a real thing that happens in the world, and has happened since long before there were words for it. That quiet alarm, that low background hum of wrongness, that instinct to look up without knowing why, these are real systems, doing real work, based on real inputs that the conscious mind hasn't processed yet. The researchers call it thin slicing, the brain's ability to make accurate assessments from very small amounts of information, faster than conscious thought can keep up with. You're reading something. You don't know what you're reading. You just know. Mara knew. She knew it the first afternoon by the river, and she explained it away. And nothing terrible happened, because she also got lucky. She got lucky in a particular way that looked like an unexpected visitor with a day pack and a wrong turn. She got lucky, and she got out. I think about the other women from those forum posts a lot. The ones who wrote trip reports, the ones who called the ranger station, the ones who also felt something and then had to figure out what to do with it. I hope they got out too. If you're someone who spends time in wild places, and I hope you are, because those places are worth it, they're worth every bit of the discomfort and the work and the occasional fear, take this with you. Trust the first feeling. The one before you have a chance to argue with yourself about it. The one that comes without evidence and without explanation. You don't owe it a justification. You don't owe anyone a justification. The forest will be there when you come back. The trail will be there. The cedars and the river and the birds in the morning. All of it will be exactly where you left it. You can come back when it feels right, and you can have that beautiful, peaceful, unremarkable trip. But if it doesn't feel right, if something lands in your body and says, "Not today," listen to that. Pack up, walk out, drive home, text your friend, say you're safe. Because safe is the thing. Safe is the whole thing. Thanks for watching. If this story got to you the way it got to me, share it with someone who spends time outdoors alone. Not to scare them, but because knowing is better than not knowing. There's a subscribe button if you want to stick around, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves out there.